I spent weeks in a cold hospital bed fighting for my very life after a brutal hit and run. My chest was crushed. My arm was shattered. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the deafening silence from my own blood. Not a single member of my family came to see me. Not my mother. Not my father. Not my sister. A month into my agonizing recovery, my phone finally buzzed. It was a text from my mother. She did not ask if I was breathing. She wrote that they needed the $32,000 from my insurance payout to buy my sister a custom wedding dress from Paris. I stared at the screen, realized my family was truly dead to me, and logged into my banking app. I sent her exactly $1 and replied with 2 words: "Good luck." A few hours later, my front door was kicked open. They expected a broken, submissive daughter ready to hand over her savings to save the family reputation. What they did not know was that while I was lying in that hospital bed, I had not just been fighting for my life. As a forensic accountant, I had been digging into their flawless lives. And I was about to expose a secret that would send my sister's fiancé to prison and leave my parents homeless. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity long ago, but maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of duty. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like an outcast. Growing up in Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. Waking up in the Chicago intensive care unit was a masterclass in profound isolation. The harsh, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors served as my only company in that sterile room. The smell of strong bleach and medical-grade sanitizer burned my nostrils with every shallow breath I took. My right arm was encased in a heavy plaster cast, immobilized and aching with a dull, relentless pressure. My chest throbbed with a blinding agony that radiated through my entire torso, a brutal reminder of the massive vehicle that had slammed into me and sped away into the night without a second thought. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. I turned my head, hoping against all rational logic to see a vase of flowers, a colorful balloon, or perhaps the worried face of someone who loved me. There was absolutely nothing. The guest chairs pushed against the pristine white walls were completely empty. I had been in a coma for weeks, fighting a battle on the very edge of death, and my family had not bothered to claim a single one of those chairs. The night of the accident replayed in my mind like a horrifying movie. I had been walking home from my accounting firm after a grueling 14-hour shift analyzing fraudulent corporate tax returns. It was raining heavily, the streets slick and dangerous. Out of nowhere, a matte black sports car had careened around the corner, its engine roaring like a beast. The vehicle struck me with terrifying force, launching me into the cold, wet pavement. The driver did not even hit the brakes. The taillights simply vanished into the dark, leaving me gasping for air as my ribs collapsed. Lying in the rain, fading into darkness, my last conscious thought had been a desperate hope that my parents would come looking for me. Now, staring at the empty hospital room, I realized how utterly foolish that hope had been. My survival was a solitary victory. The heavy door to my room pushed open and Aunt Gloria walked in. She was the head nurse of the department and my mother's older sister. However, Aunt Gloria was the only family member who had never been blinded by the toxic vanity and social climbing obsession that plagued the rest of our relatives. She did not offer me hollow pity or fake sympathy as she checked my vitals. Instead, her face was set in a tight, grim expression that told me she was carrying news far heavier than my medical chart. She pulled a tablet from her pocket and held it up so I could see the screen clearly. It was an Instagram post from my mother, Vivian. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart sinking like a stone. The photo showed my mother clinking crystal champagne flutes at an exclusive luxury bridal boutique in downtown Atlanta. Beside her stood my younger sister Chloe, twirling in a lavish white gown. Chloe was 25 years old, a former beauty queen at Howard University and the shining star of her Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority chapter. She was the undisputed golden child of the family, the one who did everything right by my parents' superficial standards. The caption beneath the photo read perfectly, "Nothing stops this family blessings, counting down to the wedding of the century." Chloe and my mother lived for the social spotlight. Their entire existence revolved around alumni events at historically Black colleges and universities, organizing elite galas and ensuring everyone knew our family name. To them, my lack of interest in pledging a sorority or attending high society charity balls was an unforgivable sin. I preferred complex spreadsheets, financial audits, and unmasking corporate criminals. They saw my practical life as an embarrassment that threatened their carefully curated image. Vivian wanted a daughter who married a doctor or a lawyer, someone who could elevate her standing among the church elders and the country club ladies. Julian, with his tailored suits and loud confidence, was the golden ticket they had been praying for. I did not cry. I think I had run out of tears a long time ago. Instead, I just stared at the screen as a chilling memory washed over me. I remembered the chaotic night I was brought into the emergency room. I was bleeding heavily, drifting in and out of consciousness in the brightly lit trauma bay. Through the haze of pain and medical personnel rushing around me, I distinctly heard Aunt Gloria screaming into a phone out in the hallway. She was shouting at my father, Jerome. My father was a prominent megachurch pastor and a highly connected real estate broker in Atlanta. He was a man who cared about his congregation and his bank accounts infinitely more than his own flesh and blood. In my fragmented memory, I could hear Aunt Gloria pleading with him to get on a plane to Chicago immediately, because his oldest daughter was dying. But Jerome had flatly refused to leave the country club. He was in the middle of securing a multi-million-dollar property deal on the golf course with Chloe's fiancé, Julian Sterling. Julian was a flashy, charismatic investment broker who drove expensive sports cars and wore tailored suits. My father saw Julian as the ultimate prize for the family, a man who would elevate their status to the highest tier of the African-American elite in the city. A massive real estate commission and a fancy wedding were simply more important than a daughter bleeding out on a hospital table. The undeniable reality of their priorities crashed over me right there in the intensive care unit. I was nothing to them. I was merely a financial burden and a social disappointment because I chose the quiet, gritty life of forensic accounting instead of marrying a wealthy man and joining the country club elite. Aunt Gloria let out a heavy sigh and silently unplugged the heart monitors from the wall. "You need to see this, Naomi," she said softly. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was my shattered, blood-stained mobile phone. The screen was cracked into a spiderweb pattern from the impact of the hit and run, but it still managed to power on. Gloria handed it to me carefully. "You have one unread message from your mother," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. I swiped the cracked screen to open my messages. My mother had not asked how I was feeling. She had not asked if the doctors had managed to repair my shattered arm or if I was finally breathing on my own without a ventilator. The text message contained exactly 2 sentences. "We know you are getting a $32,000 insurance payout from the accident. We need you to transfer it to us immediately because Chloe's custom wedding dress from Paris is short on funding and we cannot let Julian's family think we are struggling." A cold, sharp clarity settled over my mind. For years I had craved their love and acceptance. I had attended their ridiculous Sunday dinners, endured their constant comparisons, and swallowed my pride to keep the peace. But lying there with a broken body, reading a message that demanded my trauma money to fund a vanity project for the sister who never even called me. The last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snapped completely. I did not type out an angry paragraph. I did not demand an explanation or beg for the compassion they were entirely incapable of giving. I opened my banking application, ignoring the searing pain radiating down my wrist. I navigated to the transfer section, typed in my mother's bank account details, and entered the amount. I transferred exactly $1. I switched back to the messaging application and typed a 2-word reply. Good luck. I hit send and let the phone drop onto my hospital blanket. The message was delivered. The $1 transfer was confirmed. Aunt Gloria watched me in silence for a long moment before giving a firm, approving nod. She knew exactly what I was doing. They had always treated me like I was socially unfit and financially useless. They believed my job as a forensic accountant was boring and grimy compared to their glamorous lives. But my career had trained me to find the hidden truths buried beneath perfect facades. I knew how to follow the money, how to spot the lies in a ledger, and how to ruin a corrupt enterprise with a single spreadsheet. I closed my eyes and let the painkillers wash over me, making a silent vow to myself right then and there. I was going to investigate Julian Sterling. I was going to audit my father's megachurch finances. I was going to tear down the pristine illusion my mother had built her entire life around. They wanted my $32,000 to save their reputation. I was going to use my skills to ensure they had no reputation left to save. The dominoes were officially set in motion, and I was fully prepared to watch them fall one by satisfying one. 2 weeks later, the sterile hospital walls were replaced by the familiar gray paint of my own apartment. My recovery was a slow, agonizing process. Every breath felt like a shard of glass pressing against my ribs, and my right arm remained secured in a heavy cast. I was barely able to walk from the kitchen to the living room, without leaning heavily against the walls for support. The physical therapist had warned me about the pain, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer exhaustion that accompanied simple tasks. I sat at my small dining table staring at a mountain of medical bills that had already begun to pile up. The numbers printed on the crisp white paper were staggering. I was calculating the exact deductions and insurance adjustments when a violent pounding echoed through my apartment. Before I could even attempt to stand, the deadbolt clicked. My mother had always kept a spare key for emergencies. Apparently, her definition of an emergency involved a wedding dress. The heavy wooden door burst open, crashing against the hallway wall. Vivian and Chloe stormed into my sanctuary like an invading army. They were dressed immaculately, a sharp contrast to my oversized sweatpants and bruised face. My mother wore a pristine white Chanel suit, her hair styled into a flawless bob that defied the humid Atlanta weather. Chloe trailed closely behind her, wearing a designer silk blouse and clutching a rare Hermes bag. The overwhelming scent of their expensive floral perfumes instantly suffocated the small space, masking the clinical smell of my pain relief creams. They did not rush to my side. They did not ask how my shattered ribs were healing. They did not even look at the medical braces strapped to my body. My mother marched straight to my dining table and slammed her designer handbag down. Her eyes were blazing with a manic, insulted fury. She pulled out her phone aggressively, tapping the screen before shoving it in my face. "You sent me $1 single," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a pitch I had only ever heard her use when a country club event did not go her way. $1. Is this some kind of sick joke to you? I leaned back in my chair, wincing as a sharp pain shot up my spine. I maintained my composure, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I assumed you needed a contribution to your vanity fund. I contributed what I felt your request was worth." Vivian gasped, her face twisting in pure rage. She swept her manicured hand across the table, violently slapping my stack of medical bills onto the hardwood floor. The papers scattered everywhere, a visual representation of the chaos she always brought into my life. "You ungrateful wretch," she screamed. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. We come from a long, proud lineage of excellence. Your grandfather was a founding member of his fraternity. I am a legacy member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. We sent you to Howard University to become a lawyer or a surgeon, to make connections, to marry into excellence. And what did you choose? You chose to sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets. You chose a grimy, boring path as a forensic accountant. You surround yourself with tax frauds and criminals instead of elevating our family name." I watched the medical bills flutter to the floor, my expression remaining completely neutral. My mother had always viewed my career as a personal insult. To her, accounting was not a prestigious field. It did not come with flashy galas or magazine covers. She could not brag about my audits at her Sunday church luncheons. Chloe immediately stepped forward, sensing the opening to play her favorite role as the ultimate victim. She let out a dramatic, rehearsed sob, burying her face in her hands. Her diamond engagement ring caught the sunlight streaming through my window, flashing brilliantly. "You are ruining everything," Chloe cried, her voice trembling with artificial despair. Julian comes from an elite family. His parents are expecting a flawless high society wedding. If I do not walk down that aisle in the custom couture gown we ordered from Paris, they will think we are poor. They will cancel the wedding. You know how important this is. You are just jealous because Julian is successful and handsome, and you are sitting here completely alone. I looked at my younger sister. She was 25 years old, yet she still threw tantrums like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. I was not jealous of her. I was exhausted by her. "I am sitting here alone because a car ran me over and shattered my bones," I replied, keeping my tone deadly quiet. "I am sitting here alone because my own family refused to visit me in the intensive care unit. My insurance payout is for my physical rehabilitation and my medical debt. It is not a slush fund for a piece of French silk you will wear for exactly 6 hours." Vivian stepped closer, leaning over me with a menacing glare. Her voice dropped to a low, threatening register. "You will write me a check for $32,000 right now. If you refuse to support your sister, I will have your father excommunicate you. He will stand at the pulpit this Sunday and announce to the entire congregation that you have turned your back on God and family. You will be dead to the entire community. No one in Atlanta will ever speak to you again." The threat was supposed to break me. In the past, the mere thought of being publicly shamed by my father in front of thousands of church members would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. Religion and community standing were their ultimate weapons. But looking at Vivian's contorted face, I felt absolutely nothing. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I gripped the edge of the table with my good hand and forced myself to stand. The pain in my ribs was blinding, a sharp, white-hot agony that threatened to buckle my knees. I refused to let them see me wince. I locked my eyes onto my mother's face, standing as tall as my broken body would allow. "Then tell him to preach it loudly," I said, my voice echoing off the walls of the apartment. "Tell him to get up on that stage and condemn me, because I will not give you a single dime. Now get out of my home, both of you." Vivian stared at me, genuinely shocked by my defiance. She was used to my silence, my eventual submission to keep the peace. Chloe stopped her fake crying, dropping her hands to reveal dry, furious eyes. "You are going to regret this," Vivian sneered, grabbing her handbag from the table. "You are going to die alone in this tiny, pathetic apartment, and we will not shed a single tear for you." She turned on her heel and marched toward the door, Chloe rushing right behind her. I stood my ground, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my fractured ribs. I watched as Vivian grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, preparing to storm out into the hallway. As the heavy door swung wide, the bright hallway lights flooded the entryway. My eyes naturally drifted past my mother's shoulder, catching a glimpse of the corridor outside. Standing there, leaning casually against the hallway wall, was Julian Sterling. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, looking every bit the wealthy investment broker my parents believed him to be. He was scrolling through his phone, clearly waiting for Vivian and Chloe to finish their extortion attempt. He looked bored, impatient, and entirely arrogant. But it was not his suit or his smug expression that caught my attention. It was his left wrist. As he raised his hand to swipe across his phone screen, his jacket sleeve slipped back. A heavy, gleaming silver watch caught the fluorescent light of the corridor. My breath hitched in my throat. My blood ran instantly cold, freezing the pain in my chest. I knew that watch. I knew the distinct weight of it, the specific blue tint of the dial, and the microscopic scratch on the bottom clasp. It was a limited edition Rolex Daytona. It was not just any luxury timepiece. It was my luxury timepiece. 3 years ago, I had audited a highly successful jewelry importer. As a bonus for uncovering a massive internal theft ring within his company, he had helped me secure that specific serialized Rolex at a private auction. It was an investment piece valued at over $40,000. Because my apartment security was basic at the time, I had made the catastrophic mistake of trusting my family. I had locked that watch inside a secure fireproof safe located in my parents' master bedroom closet in Atlanta. I had the only physical key, and I had memorized the digital passcode. I stared at Julian's wrist as Vivian and Chloe stepped out to join him. He smirked at me through the open doorway, completely oblivious to what he was wearing. He raised his hand, the heavy silver links of my stolen asset flashing boldly and mockingly waved goodbye before Vivian slammed the door shut in my face. The heavy thud of the door locking echoed in the sudden silence of my apartment. I sank back down into my dining chair, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my spine. My mind began to race, spinning with terrifying velocity. A forensic accountant does not see coincidences. A forensic accountant sees liabilities, unauthorized transfers, and glaring discrepancies. Julian Sterling was supposed to be a multi-millionaire hedge fund manager. He supposedly managed elite portfolios and drove a brand new sports car. Yet he was standing in my hallway wearing a watch that belonged to me. A watch that had been hidden inside a heavy steel safe inside my parents' heavily alarmed house. Why was my sister's wealthy fiancé wearing my stolen investment asset? If Julian was as rich as my family claimed, he would have a collection of his own timepieces. He would not need to pilfer a watch from his future sister-in-law. And more importantly, he could not have accessed that safe without my parents knowing. The safe was bolted to the floor of their private closet. Either they gave it to him or they allowed him to take it. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in my mind with frightening precision. The desperate demand for my $32,000 insurance payout. The frantic, unhinged need to pay for a couture wedding dress immediately. The sudden appearance of my stolen Rolex on Julian's wrist. This was not just about maintaining a wealthy facade for a country club wedding. This was about a severe, catastrophic lack of liquid cash. My family was completely broke. And Julian Sterling, the golden boy, the elite investor, the perfect son-in-law, was somehow at the center of their financial ruin. I looked down at the medical bills scattered across the floor. The pain in my body vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. They thought they could break into my home, demand my money, and walk away wearing my stolen property. They thought my job was boring. They thought I just sat behind a desk looking at spreadsheets. They were about to learn exactly how dangerous a spreadsheet could be. I dragged myself off the dining room chair, my broken ribs protesting with a sharp flare of agony. Instead of breaking down, instead of crying over a mother who had just extorted me and a sister who had paraded my stolen property in my face, I walked to the front door. I slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place, engaging the chain lock for good measure. I grabbed a prescription painkiller from the bathroom counter and swallowed it dry. The time for emotional paralysis was completely over. It was time to go to work. I settled onto my sofa and pulled my encrypted laptop onto my lap. As a forensic accountant, I lived in a world of digital footprints. People lie, but numbers never do. Every transaction leaves a trace. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing security protocols with muscle memory. I needed to know exactly how Julian had acquired my Rolex. My first target was the residential security system at my parents' estate in Atlanta. I had installed their network 5 years ago, linking the primary server to my administrative account. They never bothered to learn how it worked, meaning they never realized I still had backdoor access. I initiated a secure tunnel and pulled up the access logs for the master bedroom suite. The safe was located in my father's walk-in closet. I filtered the data, searching for the specific signature of the safe's keypad. The records populated instantly. The safe had been opened exactly 1 week ago. I cross-referenced the timestamp with the interior motion sensors. 2 heat signatures were recorded in the closet at that exact moment. I pulled the archived video feed from the hallway camera. The grainy footage buffered before revealing my father Jerome walking into the bedroom alongside Julian Sterling. My father had actively walked Julian to the safe, entered the passcode, and handed him my watch. The betrayal was absolute. My father had not been robbed. He was a willing accomplice. Why would a megachurch pastor hand over a stolen asset to a supposedly wealthy investment broker? The pain medication began to dull the sharp edges of my fractured bones, allowing my mind to sharpen into a lethal, singular focus. If Julian was stealing watches, he was desperate for capital. I opened a new encrypted browser window and began pulling public financial records. My family worshipped the ground Julian walked on because they believed he was a hotshot hedge fund manager pulling in millions of dollars a year. He drove a Porsche, wore designer suits, and talked a big game about aggressive portfolio diversification. I logged into the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority database. Anyone legally managing investments or trading securities in the United States must be registered here. I typed Julian Sterling into the Central Registration Depository. The search engine spun before returning a bright red error message. No active records found. I adjusted the search parameters to include previous states' aliases and corporate variations. The result was exactly the same. Julian Sterling did not hold a single active broker license. He was not legally authorized to trade a single stock. The man my family paraded around the country club as a financial genius was a complete and total fraud. I dug deeper, pulling his tax filings and limited liability company registrations through a skip tracing database. Julian had a web of shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada states notorious for protecting corporate anonymity. But Julian was sloppy. He used the same registered agent for all of them. I downloaded the incorporation documents and began mapping the corporate structure. The companies had generic names like Sterling Holdings and Apex Consulting Group. However, their banking activity told a different story. I pulled a credit history report linked to his primary corporate tax identification number. The accounts were not holding vast wealth. They were hemorrhaging cash. Massive withdrawals were being made daily, and none were going to investment firms. I needed to connect the stolen watch to his cash flow. I accessed a secured database utilized by luxury pawnbrokers and high-end auction houses. When a serialized asset like a limited edition Rolex enters the gray market, it triggers a quiet alert among certified dealers. I inputted the unique serial number of my Daytona. A match popped up immediately. The watch had been leveraged against a short-term high-interest cash loan 3 days ago. Julian was not wearing my watch because he liked the style. He was wearing it because he had temporarily pawned it and was flaunting it before surrendering it to his creditors. I traced the origin of the pawn transaction. The business was a registered pawn shop operating out of a warehouse district in Atlanta. But the owner of the pawn shop had a lengthy public record. A quick search through the state criminal database revealed the owner had been indicted twice for running illegal underground sports betting operations. The pieces locked into place with horrifying clarity. Julian Sterling was not a hedge fund manager. He was a degenerate gambler. He was using his shell companies to funnel money into high-stakes underground gambling rings. The massive daily withdrawals on his credit report were not bad trades. They were losing bets. He was in deep with dangerous creditors, placing bets he could not cover and spiraling into a bottomless pit of debt. He had presented himself to my family as a wealthy savior, and they had been too blinded by his flashy suits and charm to verify a single thing he said. Julian was completely broke, and he was taking my family down with him. My fingers paused over the keyboard as a sickening realization washed over me. If Julian was drowning in gambling debts and my father had willingly handed over my $40,000 watch to appease him, the financial bleeding had to extend far beyond a stolen timepiece. My parents were obsessed with their social standing. They would do anything to protect the illusion of their elite status. If Julian's creditors were threatening to expose him, Julian would have inevitably threatened to embarrass my family by calling off the high-profile wedding. To my parents, a canceled wedding and public humiliation were worse than death. They would pay any price to silence a scandal. I opened a new tab and accessed the Fulton County Property Tax Records database. I navigated to the deed archives and typed in my parents' residential address. My grandfather had built that sprawling ancestral home with his own hands. He had paid off the mortgage decades ago, leaving the estate completely debt-free to my parents. It was the absolute crown jewel of our family history, a symbol of generational wealth and stability. It was the only genuinely valuable asset my parents possessed that was not leased, rented, or built on credit. I pulled up the current deed history and waited for the document to load. When the file rendered, the blood drained entirely from my face. My breath caught sharply in my throat, aggravating my broken ribs, but I could not pull my eyes away from the screen. Just 2 months ago, Vivian and Jerome had taken out a massive second mortgage on the property. They had leveraged the entire value of our debt-free ancestral home, signing away the equity my grandfather had bled for. The loan was for an astronomical sum, enough to cripple them financially for the rest of their natural lives. The monthly payments would easily eclipse my father's legitimate church salary. But the most horrifying detail was not the mortgage itself. It was the disbursement of the funds. In standard real estate transactions, loan funds are dispersed to specific escrow accounts or verified financial institutions. I tracked the electronic wire transfer attached to the loan origination document. The bank had not wired the money to my parents' personal checking account. They had not wired it to a legitimate investment portfolio. With a few rapid keystrokes, I traced the routing number of the receiving account. The screen blinked, matching the routing number to a business entity. The massive mortgage payout had been wired directly into one of Julian Sterling's anonymous shell companies. Specifically, the shell company that I had just linked to the underground gambling ring. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the glow of the laptop illuminating my bruised face. The sheer magnitude of their deception was staggering. My parents were not just victims of a smooth-talking con artist. They were active, desperate participants in his fraud. They had willingly mortgaged our family legacy, destroying decades of generational wealth simply to hand the cash over to a degenerate gambler. They were actively funding his illicit gambling debts to save face, terrified that if Julian went bankrupt, the city's elite would cancel their country club memberships and mock Chloe's ruined wedding. They were bankrupting themselves to buy a lie. And yet they had the absolute audacity to kick down my doorstand over my broken body and demand my medical insurance payout to fund a wedding dress. They were willing to leave me with a mountain of medical debt, fully knowing they had just thrown away hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover a gambling syndicate. The $32,000 they were extorting from me was not just for a piece of Parisian silk. It was a desperate scrambling attempt to plug a leak in a sinking ship. They were drowning in Julian's debt, and they expected me to happily serve as their life raft. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, a cold, dangerous smile slowly spreading across my face. Julian was a fraud. My parents were secretly destitute. The entire foundation of their elite social standing was built on quicksand. I closed the property records tab and opened a fresh spreadsheet. The forensic hunt had only just begun. I was going to follow every single dollar. I was going to unearth every single lie. And when I presented them with the final balance sheet, the cost of their vanity was going to be everything they had left. The glow of my laptop screen felt like a beacon in the dark apartment. I did not stop at the property records. My mind was operating with the cold precision of a machine. If my parents were desperate enough to break into my apartment and extort their severely injured daughter for $32,000 just to buy a wedding dress, the financial bleeding had to be massive. A second mortgage on a paid-off home was a temporary bandage for a hemorrhage. Julian was a degenerate gambler draining their accounts, but gamblers always needed more cash. They needed a constant, untraceable flow of money. My father had access to exactly that kind of cash. Jerome was not just a real estate broker. He was the founder and head pastor of a massive megachurch in the heart of Atlanta. Every Sunday, thousands of devoted followers poured their hard-earned money into the offering plates. They gave 10% of their modest incomes, trusting their spiritual leader to use those tithes for the betterment of the community. They funded building expansions, missionary trips, and youth programs. My father controlled all of it. I cracked my knuckles, ignoring the sharp protest of my injured arm, and opened a new browser tab. I navigated directly to the Internal Revenue Service public database. Megachurches often operate in a gray area of financial reporting, but certain tax filings remain public record. I needed to see his Form 990. It is the document tax-exempt organizations must file annually detailing their revenue expenses and executive compensation. I pulled the last 5 years of filings for my father's church. At first glance, the numbers looked standard. Millions in donations coming in millions, going out for operational costs, salaries, and charity. But a forensic accountant does not look at the big numbers. We look at the margins. We look at the newly formed vendors and the vaguely titled expenses. I exported the data into a master spreadsheet and ran a comparative analysis script. I wanted to see the year-over-year changes in expense categories. Within 30 seconds, my screen highlighted a massive anomaly. 2 years ago, right around the time Julian Sterling started dating my sister, a new expense category appeared on the church ledger. It was labeled simply as an urban community outreach initiative. In its first year, the program received $50,000. In the second year, that number skyrocketed to over $300,000. There were no corresponding public events, no press releases, no visible charity work. An outreach program receiving that much funding should have a massive local footprint. It should have soup kitchens, after-school tutoring centers, or housing assistance programs. But I knew for a fact that my father's church had not launched any new initiatives. He loved the spotlight too much to keep a successful charity quiet. He would have invited the local news to cut a ribbon. The money was vanishing into a black hole. I needed to know who was managing that specific fund. I isolated the tax identification number associated with the outreach program and ran it through a corporate registry database. Every legal business or charity must have an employer identification number. It is the corporate equivalent of a Social Security number. I tracked the employer identification number for the Urban Community Outreach Initiative. The search query spun for a few tense seconds before returning a match. The initiative was not registered as a nonprofit organization. It was registered as a private limited liability company in the state of Delaware. The registered agent on the filing was a corporate proxy service designed to hide the true owners. But they had to list a primary mailing address for tax purposes. I copied the mailing address and cross-referenced it with my existing spreadsheet of Julian Sterling's shell companies. My breath caught in my throat. It was an exact match. The address belonged to a post office box in a strip mall, the very same box Julian used to register the shell company that received my parents' second mortgage payout. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. My father was not just a naive victim of a bad loan. He was an active, willing accomplice in a massive embezzlement scheme. He was stealing from his own congregation. Jerome was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in church tithes and building fund donations directly into Julian's pockets. He was robbing the hardworking families who sat in his pews every Sunday, families who trusted him with their spiritual and financial well-being. He was taking their sacrifice and using it to keep his perfect future son-in-law afloat. He was funding a degenerate underground gambling ring with money meant for the poor and the faithful. The sheer scale of the hypocrisy and corruption was staggering. My father was a criminal hiding behind a pulpit and a tailored suit. Suddenly, their desperate extortion attempt earlier that day made perfect sickening sense. Julian was likely being threatened by his underground creditors. The church funds and the second mortgage were clearly gone, swallowed by bad bets and massive losses. The creditors were demanding payment, and Julian was demanding money from my parents to cover his tracks. The wedding was just a convenient excuse, a smokescreen to hide their absolute financial terror. They needed my $32,000 to temporarily stop the bleeding. They were perfectly willing to let me drown in medical debt to buy themselves a few more days. I sat back in my chair, the ambient light of the laptop casting long shadows across my living room. The physical pain in my shattered ribs was momentarily eclipsed by a profound, hollow sense of betrayal. They were not just toxic narcissists obsessed with their social standing. They were willing to destroy lives, defraud their community, and extort their own injured daughter to protect a dangerous lie. I stared at the blinking cursor, preparing to dig into the individual church board members to see who else was complicit. But before my fingers could touch the keyboard, a notification chimed. A small rectangular alert popped up in the top right corner of my screen. It was an email from my personal life insurance provider. The subject line was flagged with high importance. Inquiry, denial notice. I frowned, confusion cutting through my focused rage. I had not made any inquiries about my life insurance policy. I had set up a standard policy years ago through my accounting firm as a basic financial safeguard, but I rarely thought about it. I clicked the notification opening the secure email client. The message was brief, stating that a recent request had been flagged. The email text read that a requested action regarding policy termination and payout could not be processed due to insufficient medical verification. A secure PDF document was attached to the email detailing the denied request. I hovered my mouse over the attachment icon. My hands were suddenly trembling, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The forensic accountant in me recognized the distinct smell of yet another fraud, but the daughter in me was terrified of what I was about to find. I double-clicked the file and waited for the encrypted document to render on my screen. The PDF loaded, displaying formal letterhead from the insurance claims department. I began to read the dense legal text, my eyes scanning the paragraphs. I stopped breathing. The words blurred together and a sickening wave of nausea washed over me. I had to read the paragraph 3 times to fully comprehend the horrific reality printed in black and white. While I was lying in that Chicago intensive care unit, trapped in a medically induced coma, fighting for every single breath, my parents had contacted the insurance company. They had not called to update my medical status. They had called to cash out. The document revealed that my parents had attempted to legally declare me brain dead. They had submitted preliminary paperwork to the insurance company, falsely claiming that my doctors had given up all hope of recovery and that life support was going to be terminated. But the most horrifying detail was not their attempt to declare me dead. It was the policy itself. The document referenced a secret $1.5 million life insurance policy that my parents had taken out on my life several years ago, entirely without my knowledge or consent. They were the sole beneficiaries. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my deeply bruised chest. They had willingly let me rot completely alone in that hospital bed because a dead daughter meant a massive payday for them. My unexpected and miraculous survival ruined their ultimate payout. The $32,000 they were desperately demanding right now was not my medical payout at all. It was simply the total accumulated cancellation refund of that very policy. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. My own flesh and blood had placed a specific, calculated price tag on my life. $1.5 million. That was my exact worth to the people who had brought me into this world. I sat completely still, my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my laptop. The pain radiating from my shattered ribs and heavily casted arms suddenly felt incredibly distant. The initial shock of their financial extortion was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. This was no longer just a case of corporate embezzlement or degenerate underground gambling. This was profoundly personal. If my parents were willing to let me die alone in a hospital bed to secure a massive insurance payout, I had to question everything about the accident that put me there. What if the reckless driver who had left me bleeding out on the cold Chicago pavement was deeply connected to this tangled web of family fraud? I closed the life insurance document and opened a secure encrypted portal connected to the Chicago Police Department database. As a forensic accountant who regularly collaborated with law enforcement, I possessed high-level clearance credentials. I typed in my unique identification number, letting the system authenticate my access. I needed to see the raw, unfiltered facts of the night my life was violently derailed. I navigated through the labyrinth of digital files, my fingers moving with practiced precision. The comprehensive police report materialized on my screen. I braced myself and began reading the clinical language of the responding officers. The report detailed the exact coordinates of the intersection where I was struck. It described the severe weather conditions and the lack of immediate civilian witnesses. But as I scrolled down to the physical evidence section, my eyes locked onto a critical detail. The crime scene investigators had recovered microscopic paint scrapings embedded deeply into the fibers of my ruined wool coat. The laboratory analysis identified the paint as a highly specific custom matte black finish. Furthermore, a blurry traffic camera situated 2 blocks away had captured a partial image of the fleeing vehicle. It was a high-end sports car moving at terrifyingly reckless speeds. The camera had failed to capture the entire license plate, but it clearly recorded the last 3 digits and the state of registration. Georgia. A matte black sports car registered in the state of Georgia. The mathematical improbability of that specific vehicle striking me in Chicago sent a terrifying jolt of adrenaline straight through my veins. My mind flashed back to the country club engagement party my parents had hosted for Chloe and Julian 6 months ago. The highlight of that opulent evening was my father grandly presenting Julian with his ultimate welcome to the family gift. Jerome had handed his future son-in-law the keys to a brand-new custom-painted matte black Porsche 911. My father had loudly boasted to every single church elder and country club member in attendance about the custom paint job, bragging that there was not another vehicle exactly like it on the East Coast. The pieces of this horrifying puzzle were colliding with lethal, undeniable force. I opened a new secure browser tab and utilized my professional access to enter the National Department of Motor Vehicles database. My hands were shaking, but my keystrokes remained fiercely accurate. I entered the state of Georgia, specified the make and model as a Porsche 911, and inputted the custom matte black color designation. Finally, I typed in the 3 partial license plate digits captured by the Chicago traffic camera. I hit the enter key and held my breath as the database scoured millions of vehicle registration records. The system processed the search query, filtering down the parameters until a single match appeared on my screen. The vehicle identification number, the exact license plate, and the current registered owner were displayed in stark, undeniable text. The car belonged to Julian Sterling. The air vanished from my lungs. The sterile facts on my glowing screen confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. Julian did not just stumble into a bad investment or a dangerous gambling syndicate. He was the monster behind the wheel of the vehicle that had crushed my ribs and shattered my arm. The man preparing to marry my sister, the man my father was aggressively protecting with embezzled church funds, was the exact same man who had run me off the road and left me for dead in the freezing rain. He had struck me with thousands of pounds of accelerating metal and simply driven away, perfectly content to let me bleed out on the asphalt to protect his own skin. I needed to know why he was in Chicago that night. Why would an Atlanta-based investment broker be recklessly speeding through a Midwestern storm? I switched back to the financial spreadsheets I had compiled earlier. I pulled up the credit card statements and banking activity associated with Julian's hidden shell companies. I isolated the transactions from the exact date of my accident. The digital trail he left behind was incredibly sloppy, highlighting the frantic, disorganized actions of a desperate addict. The records showed a massive unauthorized withdrawal of $50,000 from my father's community outreach account earlier that afternoon. A few hours later, a transaction was registered at an elite underground casino located just outside the Chicago city limits. Julian had flown to my city to gamble away stolen church funds at a high-stakes poker table. The credit card receipts painted a vivid, damning picture of his night. He had purchased thousands of dollars in premium alcohol at the casino bar. The timestamps on the drink purchases continued right up until 45 minutes before the accident. He was not just driving recklessly. Julian Sterling was driving heavily intoxicated after blowing through $50,000 of embezzled money. In a drunken, panicked rage over his massive gambling losses, he had gotten behind the wheel of his high-performance sports car, sped through the dark city streets, and violently struck his future sister-in-law. He had fled the scene because stopping would have meant a breathalyzer test and arrest, and the absolute destruction of his wealthy facade. A hit-and-run felony would have sent him to prison and completely derailed the lavish high society wedding my family was so desperately trying to execute. My investigative focus shifted to the aftermath of the crash. Julian had destroyed me, but how had he managed to hide a damaged, custom-painted Porsche from the authorities and my family? The answer hit me with a sickening wave of revulsion. He had not hidden it from my family. I remembered the cell phone account. Because my father insisted on controlling every aspect of our lives, he still maintained the master administrative access to our shared family mobile plan. Since I paid my portion of the bill directly to him, my phone was still linked to the primary account. I logged into the cellular provider portal, bypassing the security questions, with answers only a family member would know. I accessed the detailed call logs for my father's personal phone number, filtering the data to the specific date of the hit and run. I scrolled down to the exact time of the accident. The police report estimated the collision occurred at 11:42 at night. I checked my father's call log. At exactly 11:47 at night, just 5 minutes after my body was slammed into the pavement, my father received an incoming call. The number belonged to Julian Sterling. The duration of the call was logged at 40 minutes. My blood turned entirely to ice. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the digital proof of my family's ultimate unforgivable betrayal. Julian had not called an ambulance. He had not called the police. He had immediately called my father. While I was lying in the freezing rain, gasping for air and slowly bleeding to death on the dark asphalt, the man who hit me was on the phone with my father. They had spent 40 minutes coordinating a cover-up. My parents knew. They knew exactly who had nearly killed their oldest daughter. They knew Julian was driving drunk. They knew he was fleeing a felony crime scene. And instead of demanding justice, instead of rushing to my side to ensure I survived, my father had helped him hide the car and bury the truth. They had actively protected the monster who shattered my body, because exposing him would have ruined the perfect wedding. Exposing Julian would have meant admitting to the church embezzlement. Exposing Julian would have destroyed the pristine elite social standing Vivian and Jerome valued above human life. They covered up my attempted murder, let me rot alone in a Chicago intensive care unit, and eagerly waited for me to die so they could cash out a secret $1.5 million life insurance policy. My trauma transformed completely. The pain in my broken bones was entirely eclipsed by a lethal, unstoppable clarity. They thought they had buried the truth. They thought I was a weak, submissive victim. They were wrong. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was an emotional luxury reserved for people who still believed in the sanctity of family. I had no family left. The people who raised me had conspired to profit from my death, and the man my sister was marrying had actively tried to murder me. Calling the Chicago Police Department to report the hit and run would have been the standard expected response. A detective would review my evidence, issue an arrest warrant for Julian Sterling, and send him to prison. But a criminal trial would only punish the physical act. It would allow my parents to play the victims, claiming they were deceived by a sociopath. They would weep on the local news, distance themselves from Julian, and maintain their pristine reputation within the Atlanta megachurch community. I was not going to let them play the victims. I was going to obliterate the entire corrupt system they had so carefully built. To dismantle a financial house of cards, you do not use a wrecking ball. You quietly buy the mortgage and change the locks. I reached across my desk and opened a secure digital vault that my family knew absolutely nothing about. Over my decade as a forensic accountant, I had structured a highly aggressive, diversified portfolio of offshore investments and tech stocks. My parents assumed my modest apartment and quiet lifestyle meant I was struggling. They never comprehended that stealth wealth was the ultimate weapon. I initiated a series of rapid liquidation protocols. I sold my high-yield mutual funds, liquidated my tech shares, and initiated wire transfers from my offshore holding accounts. Millions of dollars of untraceable liquid cash began pooling into my primary routing ledger. Next, I contacted Elias Vance, a ruthless corporate proxy attorney based in Geneva, who specialized in complete financial anonymity. Through a secure video link, I instructed Elias to immediately incorporate a blind limited liability company in Delaware. We named the entity Obsidian Holdings. By structuring it through a Swiss proxy, my name would never appear on any public registry or corporate filing. I was effectively a ghost wielding a massive financial scythe. With Obsidian Holdings fully funded and operational, I turned my attention back to Julian Sterling. His underground gambling debts were the fragile linchpin holding his entire fraudulent existence together. Illegal bookmakers and underground casino operators do not care about court orders or legal collections. They care about liquid cash, and I had plenty of it. Using my elite network of financial investigators, I routed a communication to the specific Atlanta warehouse front that held the pawned Rolex and managed Julian's betting ledger. I did not introduce myself as Zendaya. I operated purely as the legal representative of Obsidian Holdings. I proposed a simple, highly lucrative transaction. Julian Sterling owed the syndicate exactly $400,000 in outstanding gambling debts. Obsidian Holdings offered to purchase that debt in its entirety, paying the syndicate the full $400,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency, plus a 20% premium for their immediate cooperation. In exchange, the syndicate would legally assign the debt collection rights to my company, transferring all promissory notes I owe us and leverage directly into my hands. The syndicate accepted the offer within 40 minutes. Criminals appreciate efficiency. A digital contract was executed, the cryptocurrency was transferred, and I immediately received a secure file containing every desperate, panicked message Julian had sent his bookmakers. I now legally owned Julian Sterling. He was no longer indebted to the Atlanta underworld. He answered solely to me. But destroying Julian was only half the battle. I needed to tighten the noose around my parents. I pulled the origination documents for the massive second mortgage Vivian and Jerome had taken out on our debt-free ancestral home. The loan had been underwritten by a mid-tier predatory lending institution that specialized in high-risk mortgages. These institutions frequently bundle and sell their high-risk loans to larger holding companies to clear their own books. I instructed Elias Vance to approach the lending institution directly on behalf of Obsidian Holdings. We offered to purchase the promissory note on my parents' estate at face value. Because the mortgage was severely over-leveraged and categorized as a massive liability, the lending institution was thrilled to offload the risk. The transaction was completely legal standard corporate maneuvering. The paperwork was expedited, the wire transfer cleared, and the title transfer was registered with the county clerk. I sat back in my living room, the pain in my healing ribs completely forgotten, and stared at the final confirmation emails illuminating my laptop screen. I was now the absolute legal owner of my family's entire financial existence. My father's treasured megachurch empire and my mother's flawless country club reputation were entirely resting in the palm of my hand. With one single stroke of my pen, I possessed the legal authority to foreclose on the sprawling ancestral home they worshipped. I could force them onto the street bankrupt Julian Sterling before he even walked down the aisle and expose the massive church embezzlement scheme to the federal authorities. I held the absolute power to ruin their lives with a few swift emails. I had successfully cornered them in a trap they had unknowingly built for themselves. Every document, every wire transfer, and every forged life insurance application was meticulously saved, encrypted, and backed up across 3 separate secure servers. I reviewed the digital file representing Julian's purchased debt. It included audio files of Julian weeping over the phone to his former bookmakers, begging for more time, promising that his wealthy future father-in-law would steal more church funds to cover the staggering losses. It was pathetic. The golden boy my mother constantly praised was nothing more than a sniveling coward, stealing from the congregation to feed an uncontrollable addiction. The physical evidence was equally damning. I arranged the printouts of my parents' life insurance scheme next to the hit-and-run police report. They had sat in that hospital waiting room pretending to mourn my tragic accident, while secretly plotting to unplug my life support and collect a multi-million-dollar payout. They had calculated my death into their financial recovery plan. Their greed was so bottomless that they were willing to sacrifice their own flesh and blood to maintain the illusion of high society perfection. But a simple foreclosure and a quiet bankruptcy proceeding were not going to be enough. Sending a collection notice or a legal cease and desist letter would be far too easy for them. If I simply foreclosed on their estate, they would spin a tragic narrative. They would stand before the megachurch congregation on Sunday morning, weeping crocodile tears, claiming that the devil was testing their faith. They would manipulate their loyal followers into launching a massive fundraising campaign to save their beloved pastor from sudden financial ruin. They would emerge as martyrs, and Julian would likely flee the state before the authorities could definitively link him to the Chicago hit and run. I could not allow them to control the narrative. I could not give them a chance to quietly sweep their catastrophic failures under the rug. I needed to strip away their power publicly. I needed to trap them in a corner where their lies could not save them. To truly destroy the architects of my ruin, I needed a stage. I needed an audience consisting of the very people they were trying to impress. I needed the church elders, the country club elites, the wealthy socialites, and the local politicians. I needed the exact demographic they had sold their souls to appease. My phone suddenly vibrated on the coffee table, breaking the absolute silence of my apartment. The harsh buzzing sound pulled my focus away from the financial documents scattered across my lap. I reached over and picked up the device. The screen illuminated with a new text message. The sender was Chloe. I stared at the notification, my expression remaining completely neutral. My younger sister had not bothered to check on my medical recovery since storming out of my apartment earlier today. She had not asked if my pain was manageable or if my breathing had improved. Her only concern was her Parisian silk wedding dress and the flawless execution of her upcoming high society nuptials. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. The text was remarkably brief, laced with the venomous entitlement she had perfected over the past decade. It read, "You are a miserable spinster. Julian and I do not want your toxic energy ruining our perfect weekend. Do not even think about showing up to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night." I read the words, letting the sheer audacity of her statement wash over me. She truly believed she was in control. She had no idea that the miserable spinster she was mocking now legally owned every single asset her family possessed. I smiled. I locked my phone standing up. I smiled. I locked my phone standing up. The sharp pain in my ribs was entirely eclipsed by a rush of cold, strategic adrenaline. Chloe thought she held the power to banish me from her perfect weekend. She believed a simple text message could silence the miserable spinster. But my sister had fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. I was not going to crash her rehearsal dinner. I was going to be invited as the guest of honor. To defeat a narcissist, you do not use logic or reason. You feed their ego until they choke on it. My mother was the gatekeeper to the wedding events, and she operated on two basic currencies: absolute submission and liquid cash. I had to offer her both. I took a deep breath, practicing the necessary physical shift. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I thought about the sheer agony of waking up alone in the hospital, letting the genuine trauma bring real tears to the surface of my eyes. When I felt a single drop track down my cheek, I knew the performance was ready. I picked up my phone and dialed Vivian's number. It rang 4 times. She was intentionally making me wait a classic power play to establish dominance before she even answered the call. When the line finally clicked open, she did not say hello. "What do you want, Zendaya?" She snapped, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. "I am incredibly busy finalizing the floral arrangements for your sister, and I do not have the time or the patience for another one of your ungrateful tantrums. If you are calling to complain about Chloe asking you to stay away from the dinner, you can save your breath. You brought that completely on yourself with your behavior this morning." I let out a soft, trembling sob right into the receiver. I made sure it sounded pathetic, broken, and entirely defeated. "Mom," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on the syllable. "Please do not hang up. Please." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. The sound of my submission was intoxicating to her, and I could practically hear her signaling the florist to wait while she savored her victory. I am listening, she said coldly. Make it fast. I forced another sob, squeezing my eyes shut to maintain the illusion of a shattered daughter begging for scraps of affection. Mom, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for how I acted today. You were right. You and Chloe were entirely right. I have been so selfish. Sitting here alone in this apartment looking at these medical bills, I finally realized how awful I have been. I let my jealousy ruin everything. Jealousy. Vivian repeated the word, rolling off her tongue like a sweet delicacy. I knew it. I told your father you were just acting out because Chloe is marrying an elite man while you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. You are right, I cried, infusing my voice with desperate agreement. I have been a massive disappointment to this family. I chose a boring career. I pushed people away. I was just so bitter that I got into that accident while Chloe was planning a fairy tale wedding. But it is not her fault, and it is certainly not Julian's fault. They deserve a beautiful celebration. They deserve perfection. I paused, letting my simulated breakdown echo over the line. I knew exactly how to play her. I was serving up the ultimate narcissistic supply complete capitulation. I was willingly taking the role of the jealous, inadequate scapegoat, effectively absolving them of any guilt for abandoning me in the intensive care unit. Well, Vivian said, her tone softening just a fraction, taking on that sickeningly fake maternal warmth she reserved for public appearances. It takes a big person to admit when they are entirely wrong, Zendaya. Your father and I have prayed for you to find this kind of clarity. It has been exhausting dealing with your toxic attitude. We just want peace. I want peace too, Mom, I pleaded, moving my trap into the next phase. I want to make things right. I want to buy my way back into this family's good graces. I know I cannot erase how I acted this morning, but I want to prove that I support Chloe and Julian. Buy your way back! Vivian echoed, her sharp ears instantly catching the specific phrasing. What exactly does that mean? I took a shaky breath, preparing to deploy the bait. I received some incredible news from my firm today. Despite everything that happened with the accident, my partners awarded me a massive retention bonus. It is a substantial amount of liquid cash, Mom, more than I have ever received. I was looking at it in my account, and I realized I do not want to use it on myself. I want to present it to Chloe and Julian as a surprise wedding gift, a real significant contribution to their new life together. The silence on the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding in my mother's head. The mention of a massive amount of liquid cash was the ultimate trigger. Her family was secretly bankrupt. They had just leveraged their ancestral home to pay off Julian's violent gambling debts. They were drowning, and I had just offered them a life raft filled with cash. How substantial is this bonus, Zendaya? She asked, her voice dropping to a low, hungry whisper. We are dealing with elite vendors, and Chloe deserves a very specific standard of living. It is enough to cover the dress, the remaining vendor balances, and a luxurious honeymoon. I lied effortlessly, keeping my tone eager and subservient. I want to give them the check directly. I want to stand up in front of Julian's parents, in front of the entire country club, and show everyone that the Sterling and Washington families are united. I want to make you proud, Mom. I want to show his family that we come from immense success. Greed is a powerful, blinding force. It overrides logic, caution, and common sense. Vivian did not stop to question why a forensic accounting firm would hand over a massive cash bonus to an employee recovering from a severe accident. She did not stop to wonder why the daughter who had angrily thrown her out just hours ago was suddenly offering a fortune. She only heard the word cash, and she lunged for it. Oh, my sweet girl, Vivian cooed, the transformation complete. I always knew you had a good heart buried under all that stubbornness. This is exactly what family does. We support each other. Chloe is going to be so overwhelmed by your generosity. This is the kind of legacy behavior your grandfather would have expected from you. So I can come to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night? I asked, sounding small and hopeful. I want to surprise them during the toasts. Of course you can come to the dinner, Vivian declared smoothly, having entirely forgotten Chloe's banishment text. You are my daughter. You belong there. We are hosting it at the Piedmont Driving Club. The entire Sterling family will be in attendance along with your father's most prominent church elders. It will be the perfect stage for your presentation. Thank you, Mom, I whispered. Thank you for giving me another chance. Just do me one small favor, Vivian added, her voice hardening with that familiar callous edge. Wear something long-sleeved and high-necked. You need to hide those ugly hospital scars and bruises. Julian's parents are very traditional high society people. We cannot have you looking like a battered street victim in the background of the professional photographs. It would severely embarrass us. Just put some decent makeup on and try to look presentable for once. I stared at the wall, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. My mother was telling her severely injured daughter to hide the physical evidence of nearly being murdered, simply so the country club aesthetic would not be ruined. I will wear something very appropriate, Mom, I replied, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. I promise you, no one will be looking at my scars tomorrow night. Good, Vivian said dismissively. Be at the club by 7 sharp. Do not be late. She terminated the call. I lowered the phone from my ear, letting out a long, slow breath. The trap was officially set. They were expecting a broken, apologetic spinster carrying a massive check to save their ruined finances. They had eagerly provided me with the exact stage, the exact audience, and the exact timing I needed to execute my absolute destruction of their lives. I stood up and walked into my bedroom, pulling my sleek black leather travel bag from the top of the closet. I unzipped the main compartment, but I did not reach for my clothes. I was not packing evening gowns or makeup to hide my bruises. I was packing for war. I walked back to my home office and began assembling my arsenal. I grabbed a stack of heavily encrypted USB drives, each containing the compiled digital evidence of Julian's massive gambling debts, the shell companies, and the illegal sports betting syndicate. I printed out high-resolution full-color copies of the hit-and-run police report, specifically highlighting the matte black paint scrapings and the partial license plate match to Julian's custom Porsche. I printed the cellular provider logs, showing the 40-minute phone call between Julian and my father just minutes after my body was crushed into the asphalt. Next came the financial documents. I printed the official bank statements proving the massive wire transfer of church tithes directly into Julian's anonymous LLC. I included the full tax filings for the fake Urban Community Outreach Initiative, exposing my father's extensive embezzlement operation. Finally, I printed the legal foreclosure notice and the promissory note on my parents' debt-free ancestral home alongside the horrifying life insurance documents where they had actively attempted to declare me brain dead to cash out $1.5 million. I stacked the explosive documents into pristine leather-bound presentation folders, one for Julian, one for my father, one for my mother, and several extra copies for the prominent church elders who would be seated at the head tables. I placed the folders carefully into my travel bag, sliding the encrypted USB drives into the secure side pockets. I zipped the bag shut. Everything was in place, but an execution of this magnitude required a fail-safe. Exposing a powerful megachurch pastor and an elite financial fraudster in front of Atlanta's high society was going to cause absolute violent chaos. I needed someone on the inside, someone completely immune to my parents' manipulation who could ensure the trap snapped shut without giving them an inch of breathing room to escape. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed: Aunt Gloria. Gloria was my father's older sister. Unlike Jerome, she possessed a spine of absolute steel and an uncompromising moral compass. She despised Vivian's country club elitism and routinely called out my father's hypocritical preaching. She had always been the black sheep of the Washington family, simply because she refused to bow to their toxic vanity. She loved me fiercely, and she was the only person who had relentlessly called the Chicago hospital to check on my condition while my parents ignored me. I hit dial. She answered on the second ring. "Zendaya, baby." Her warm, raspy voice filled the line. "I have been worried sick. How are you holding up?" "Aunt Gloria." "I need your help," I said, skipping the pleasantries. My voice was steady, void of any fake emotion. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Her tone shifted instantly, recognizing the severe gravity in my voice. Tell me what you need, Elle. I am flying into Atlanta tomorrow for the rehearsal dinner I instructed, staring at the black travel bag waiting by my door. I need you to be there early. I need you to secure a seat near the main exit doors of the banquet hall. And most importantly, I need you to have the local authorities on speed dial. Do not tell anyone I am coming. Just be ready. There was a brief pause. Aunt Gloria did not ask for an explanation. She did not ask for a gentle transition. She knew exactly what kind of people my parents were. I will be wearing my best suit, baby, she replied, a fierce, protective edge hardening her words. I will have the police chief's direct line queued up. You just give the signal. I hung up the phone. I looked at the medical brace strapped to my arm and felt the dull ache in my ribs. They thought they had buried me. They thought I was a casualty of their greed. Tomorrow night they would learn that I was the architect of their ruin. The flight to Atlanta was a blur of calculated anticipation. I stepped out of my rideshare in front of the columned entrance of the city's most exclusive African-American country club. Valet staff moved with quiet efficiency, opening doors for the endless parade of luxury vehicles depositing Atlanta's elite. This was the absolute pinnacle of my mother's relentless social climbing. The grand ballroom was dripping in manufactured opulence deliberately designed to project an illusion of untouchable generational wealth. I walked through the heavy double doors and the overwhelming wall of sound hit me instantly. The banquet hall was a sea of crystal chandeliers, towering floral centerpieces crafted from imported white orchids, and a curated guest list representing the zenith of my parents' network. Generations of prominent Jack and Jill members mingled effortlessly with elite HBCU alumni, sharing practiced laughs over flutes of premium champagne. Their flawless smiles masked the dark secrets they kept buried behind gated communities. They traded exaggerated compliments and ruthless networking strategies, their tailored suits masking the aggressive ambition driving their spiritual empires. The waitstaff, dressed in immaculate white coats, navigated the crowded space balancing silver trays loaded with culinary masterpieces. The air was thick with expensive perfumes, top-tier cologne, and the suffocating weight of performative high society perfection. I stood near the entryway and scanned the room, keeping my heavy black leather travel bag strapped securely to my uninjured shoulder. My right arm was still rigidly secured in its dark medical brace. Every breath sent a deep ache radiating straight through my healing ribs. I wore a conservative long-sleeved, high-necked emerald silk blouse strictly adhering to my mother's callous demand to hide the physical trauma of my attempted murder. I quietly stood back and absorbed their cruelty. Vivian spotted me before I could take another step. She disengaged from a circle of wealthy pastors' wives, her forced smile dropping into a sharp, terrifying scowl the second she turned her back to her audience. She marched across the polished marble floor, grabbing my uninjured arm with bruising force. "You are late," she hissed, her manicured fingers digging into my skin. "And why are you carrying that massive, hideous bag? You look like a transient. Hand it to the coat check immediately." "I need it with me, Mom," I whispered, playing my pathetic submissive role perfectly. "It has the special wedding gift inside. I do not want to let it out of my sight until it is time for the presentations." The mention of the financial gift worked instantly. Vivian's eyes flashed with naked greed. Her grip on my arm loosened slightly. "Fine," she snapped, glancing around nervously to ensure no one important was looking at us. "But you are not dragging that monstrosity through the main floor. You are going to sit exactly where I put you, and you are not going to speak to anyone unless spoken to. Do you understand me, Zendaya? You are not going to embarrass Chloe tonight." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes cast downward. Vivian grabbed my elbow again and steered me away from the glowing center of the room. We bypassed the elegantly draped main tables. She pushed me further back into the shadows of the banquet hall. She shoved me into a small, poorly decorated table placed unceremoniously into the darkest corner of the room, directly adjacent to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. It was the absolute worst seat in the entire venue, completely obscured behind a massive decorative pillar ensuring I remained entirely hidden from the prominent, important guests my parents were desperately trying to impress. "Stay here," Vivian ordered, her tone sharp and final. "Do not move until the toasts begin." I sank into the uncomfortable chair. I placed my heavy leather bag carefully by my feet. I watched from my hidden vantage point as my sister Chloe made her grand entrance. She strutted into the ballroom wearing a custom, heavily beaded designer evening gown that likely cost more than a luxury vehicle. She glided across the room, soaking up the adulation and praise from the wealthy attendees, her ringing laughter echoing over the loud ambient background noise. She locked eyes with me for a fraction of a second. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust flashed across her perfectly contoured face before she swiftly turned her back aggressively, ignoring her older sister's existence. She was playing the role of the flawless, untouchable bride, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire lavish lifestyle was funded by stolen church tithes and underground gambling debts. The waitstaff moved frantically in and out of the kitchen doors beside me, the loud clattering of heavy silverware and the shouting of the catering manager providing a stark contrast to the refined elegance around. I did not mind the noise or the humiliating placement. Being seated in the shadows gave me the perfect tactical advantage. I slowly unzipped the top compartment of my travel bag, verifying that the thick leather-bound evidence folders were perfectly stacked and ready for deployment. I scanned the room again, my eyes sweeping the perimeter, until I found exactly what I was looking for. Aunt Gloria was seated near the main entrance, dressed impeccably in a sharp crimson pantsuit. She caught my gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She had the local authorities on speed dial ready. The trap was completely locked in place. The gentle clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute brought the massive room to a sudden hushed silence. My father, Jerome Washington, stood at the head table basking in the glowing spotlight. He looked incredibly distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, the absolute picture of a successful, righteous spiritual leader. He raised his hands, gesturing for the room to bow their heads, and launched into a booming, highly practiced prayer. "Heavenly Father, we gather here tonight to celebrate the beautiful union of Chloe and Julian Jerome," projected to the attentive crowd. His voice rolled across the banquet hall with a rich theatrical resonance. "We thank you for blessing this family with unwavering honesty, profound integrity, and deep, unbreakable family values. We pray that this young couple builds their new life on a foundation of absolute truth and righteous devotion, just as Vivian and I have tried to model for them every single day. We thank you for the prosperity you have graciously bestowed upon us, and we ask that you continue to protect our beautiful legacy." I sat in the dark corner near the kitchen, listening to the absolute sheer hypocrisy. He was standing in front of hundreds of people preaching about honesty and integrity while actively covering up his daughter's attempted murder. He was praying for righteous devotion while actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the very community members bowing their heads in reverence. The staggering audacity of his performance was sickening, but it only fueled the cold, calculated fire burning in my chest. The prayer concluded with a resounding chorus of amens from the wealthy crowd. As the guests began taking their seats and the lavish multi-course dinner service commenced, a familiar figure detached himself from the head table and began weaving his way through the room. Julian Sterling moved with the confident, predatory swagger of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He stopped periodically to shake hands with prominent church elders, flashing a charismatic, blindingly white smile that hid the monster lurking just beneath his polished surface. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket, his hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a wealthy, successful investment broker. He approached my hidden table. He stopped just outside the glow of the overhead lighting. The heavy, unmistakable stench of expensive aged scotch radiated off him, mixing with his aggressive, suffocating arrogance. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and cruel, completely devoid of any remorse for the night he left me bleeding out on the freezing Chicago pavement. His threats meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I had the undisputed proof of his crimes secured in my bag. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on my table, bringing his face mere inches from mine to deliver his final ruthless warning to me. "I am glad you finally learned your proper place, Zendaya," he whispered, his voice a harsh, menacing hiss, meant only for my ears. "Vivian told me about your little apology tour and the massive gift you brought. You better have that check ready to hand over the second the toasts start, or I will personally make sure your father disowns you permanently. Do not ruin my night." I sat perfectly still. I slowly lowered my gaze to his left wrist. The heavy diamond-encrusted Rolex he had illegally pawned to the underground gambling syndicate gleamed brightly in the dim light. "Oh, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "I am about to pay everyone exactly what they are owed." Julian scoffed, clearly assuming my cryptic response was just a desperate attempt to save face. He straightened his velvet jacket, flashed me a patronizing smirk, and strutted back to his seat. He poured himself another glass of champagne, leaning over to whisper something into her ear that made her throw her head back in practiced artificial laughter. The clattering of silver forks against fine china gradually subsided as the catering staff cleared the main courses. A heavy, expectant hush fell over the extravagant ballroom. The time for the evening toasts had arrived. The designated master of ceremonies, a local politician who owed my father favors, tapped his crystal flute and welcomed my sister to the center stage. Chloe glided to the microphone, adjusting the folds of her designer gown to ensure the photographer captured her best angle. She sniffled softly, deploying a masterful display of fake teary-eyed emotion that captivated the room. She thanked the Sterling family. She thanked our parents for their supposedly flawless example of holy matrimony. Then she turned her gaze toward my dark corner. "I want to take a special moment to acknowledge my older sister Zendaya Chloe," announced her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. "As many of you know, she was recently in a terrible accident. It has been a very dark, very difficult time for her, but tragedy can often bring clarity. Tonight, Zendaya has decided to offer Julian and me a massive wedding gift. I am just so incredibly grateful that she is finally stepping up to support her betters and taking her proper place within this family." The room erupted into polite, restrained applause. The sheer audacity of her words, calling herself my better in front of hundreds of people, was breathtaking. My mother beamed from the front row, completely validating the public humiliation. Vivian caught my eye and gestured frantically with her manicured hand, signaling me to approach the stage and deliver the cash. I stood up slowly, ensuring my movements appeared stiff and painful. I grabbed the heavy leather travel bag from the floor, gripping the handles with my good arm. Every step I took toward the center of the ballroom felt like walking through a minefield of judging stares. The elite guests whispered behind their hands, taking in my conservative, high-necked emerald blouse and the dark medical brace securing my arm. I kept my face entirely neutral, masking the lethal adrenaline surging through my veins. I walked past tables filled with Jack and Jill members, wealthy HBCU alumni, and the most powerful pastors in the Atlanta area. These were the people my parents worshipped. These were the gatekeepers of the high society approval they valued above human life. I approached the front of the room, stopping just below the elevated stage. Julian stood beside Chloe, holding out his hand with an arrogant, expectant grin. He was waiting for me to hand him a blank check. My father sat at the head table, looking completely triumphant, fully believing his financial nightmares were about to vanish. I did not walk up the steps to join my sister. I bypassed the stage entirely and moved directly toward the front row of VIP tables. I stopped in front of Head Deacon Marcus, a stern, highly respected man who managed the primary oversight committee for his own megachurch. He looked up at me, confused by my deviation from the planned agenda. I reached into my bag and pulled out the first thick manila folder. It contained the meticulously compiled, highly classified bank statements proving his secret massive embezzlement of church tithes. I placed the heavy folder directly onto the pristine white tablecloth right in front of the head deacon. "Please hold on to this for a moment, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft ambient music. "You are going to want to review those figures very carefully before you attend Sunday service. Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he placed his hand on the thick manila folder. My father half stood from his chair, a sudden flash of panic breaking through his polished pastoral facade. Her smile froze instantly. She gripped the edge of her table, her knuckles turning white. She recognized the terrifying shift in my demeanor. The broken, submissive daughter she had bullied on the phone earlier was gone completely. Zendaya. Vivian hissed, her voice a sharp whisper. What are you doing? Get on the stage and present your gift to your sister immediately. I ignored her completely. I turned away from the head tables and walked decisively toward the professional DJ booth, positioned on the left side of the stage. The DJ, a young man hired to manage the music and the visual presentations, was queuing up a saccharine romantic slideshow of Chloe and Julian. The massive projector screens behind the stage displayed a holding graphic featuring their intertwined initials in gold font. "Excuse me," I said, stepping behind the velvet ropes surrounding the audio-visual equipment. "I need to make a slight adjustment to the presentation." The DJ blinked, completely caught off guard by my authoritative tone. "Madam, I was instructed not to alter the sequence." He started, raising a hand to block the laptop. I reached into the side pocket of my leather bag and retrieved the heavily encrypted USB drive. I did not ask for permission. I shoved the DJ aside with my shoulder, ignoring the sharp bolt of pain radiating from my injured ribs. I slammed the USB drive into the open port on the side of his primary laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the rapid, practiced precision of a forensic accountant accustomed to bypassing basic security interfaces. "Hey, you cannot do that!" the DJ protested, lunging forward. I shot him a glare so cold and uncompromising that he instantly froze in his tracks. "Do not touch this machine," I ordered. I executed the command prompt, overriding the existing presentation software. The giant projector screens behind the stage flickered violently, the golden initials disappearing into static. A loud, jarring hum echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely silencing the remaining polite chatter in the ballroom. Every guest turned their attention to the front of the room. The silence was deafening. The screens flashed to life. They were not filled with romantic photos of the happy couple walking along the beach or kissing under fireworks. The massive high-definition displays were suddenly illuminated with raw, unredacted bank statements. I had enlarged the documents and highlighted the most damning transactions in bright, undeniable red ink. The first slide displayed the exact routing numbers moving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the megachurch community outreach fund directly into a fraudulent shell company. The owner of that shell company was listed in bold black text, Julian Sterling. A collective gasp rippled through the ultra-exclusive country club. Head Deacon Marcus tore open the thick manila folder I had given him, his eyes frantically scanning the printed copies of the exact same documents now looming over the entire banquet hall. He flipped the page, his face turning an ashen shade of gray, as he realized the sheer magnitude of the theft. My father's face drained of all color. He gripped his chest, looking like he had just been struck by lightning. Jerome Deacon Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with absolute outrage. "What is this? What have you done with the community funds?" Vivian leaped out of her chair, her designer heels catching on the carpet. "Shut it off!" she screamed, pointing frantically at the DJ booth. "Shut those screens off right now! Security, remove her!" I stepped away from the laptop, leaving the damning financial evidence blazing on the massive screens for every single elite guest to witness. I walked slowly up the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the stage. Chloe was backing away from the projected images, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror. Julian looked like a cornered animal. His arrogant swagger had completely vanished, replaced by the wild, desperate panic of a man who realized his entire fraudulent life was collapsing in real time. I walked directly to the center microphone. The heavy leather bag hung from my shoulder, filled with the remaining folders containing the hit-and-run police reports, the offshore debt purchases, and the forged life insurance documents. The crowd was sitting in a state of absolute paralyzed shock. The local powerful pastors were staring at the undeniable proof of his staggering corruption. I gripped the microphone stand with my free hand. I looked down at Vivian, who was trembling with uncontrollable rage, and then at Julian, who was desperately looking around for a clear exit. I took a slow, deep breath, letting my voice project through the opulent ballroom. It cut through the heavy air like a razor-sharp scalpel. I was told to bring a gift that reflects the values of this family, I stated clearly. So I brought the truth. The microphone amplified my voice, sending it echoing off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. The sheer shock in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pinned every guest to their expensive gold Chiavari chairs. I tapped the space bar on the DJ's laptop. The massive projector screens behind me transitioned seamlessly to the next slide. I had prepared this presentation with the clinical precision of a seasoned forensic accountant preparing for a federal grand jury. I was not speaking to them as a sister or a daughter. I was presenting an airtight, undeniable indictment. I directed my laser pointer at the glowing screens. What you are looking at right now is the primary operating account for Sterling Capital Management. I announced, my voice steady and commanding. Julian presents himself to this community as a highly successful elite investment broker. He drives a custom Porsche. He wears bespoke suits. He convinced my parents, and likely many of you in this room, that he is a financial prodigy. But Sterling Capital Management is not a hedge fund. It is a hollow shell company registered in Delaware designed specifically to launder money and hide massive catastrophic liabilities. A low, frantic murmur began to ripple through the sea of country club members and church elders. I watched wealthy investors lean forward, their eyes squinting at the projected bank statements, recognizing the irrefutable formatting of authentic financial ledgers. I clicked to the next slide. The screen filled with a series of aggressive high-frequency withdrawal records. Julian Sterling does not invest in emerging markets or tech startups. I continued my gaze, locking onto the terrified groom. He invests in illegal underground sports betting syndicates. The documents currently displayed show the systematic draining of his entire portfolio. Over the past 18 months, Julian has accumulated exactly $400,000 in illicit gambling debts. He is completely bankrupt. He is utterly compromised by violent bookmakers. The murmurs escalated into audible gasps. I saw several prominent businessmen who had likely entrusted Julian with their portfolios suddenly reaching for their phones, their faces draining of blood. Julian's carefully constructed facade of East Coast elite wealth was disintegrating in real time. He was no longer the golden boy marrying into the prestigious Washington family. He was a desperate broke addict. "Shut her up!" Julian suddenly roared, his voice cracking with panicked rage. He shoved a cocktail table aside, sending crystal glasses crashing to the marble floor. He lunged forward, abandoning any pretense of high society decorum, his fists clenched as he charged the stage. He intended to physically tear the microphone from my hands and smash the laptop. He never even made it to the first step. Aunt Gloria materialized from the shadows near the exit doors with terrifying speed. She was not alone. Flanking her were two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing dark, tailored suits. They were off-duty hospital security guards, men Aunt Gloria had befriended during her endless hours pacing the waiting room while I was in the intensive care unit. They moved with professional, synchronized efficiency. As Julian tried to vault onto the stage, the two guards stepped directly into his path, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle. One of them planted a heavy hand squarely in the center of Julian's chest, shoving the groom backward with enough force to send him stumbling into the front row of chairs. "You need to sit down, son," Aunt Gloria commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who tolerated zero foolishness. "You take one more step toward my niece, and these gentlemen will happily introduce your face to the floor." Julian stared at the guards, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with humiliated terror. He slowly backed away, raising his hands in defeat, retreating into the crowd. Aunt Gloria gave me a sharp, affirming nod. The perimeter was secure. I had the floor. I turned my attention away from the ruined groom and focused my crosshairs on the man sitting paralyzed at the head table. My father. I clicked the laptop spacebar again. The massive screens flashed, replacing Julian's gambling ledgers with official, highly classified Internal Revenue Service tax filings and internal banking audits belonging to the megachurch. The logo of my father's ministry sat proudly at the top of the documents, a stark contrast to the criminal activity detailed below it. Now that we have established the groom's $400,000 deficit, we must ask ourselves a very important question. I projected scanning the faces of the outraged church elders. How exactly does a bankrupt gambling addict afford a bespoke designer wedding? How does he afford a Parisian silk dress for his bride, endless premium champagne, and a rehearsal dinner at the most exclusive club in Atlanta? The room fell into an absolute deathly silence. The air grew thick electric with the anticipation of the final lethal blow. I looked directly into my father's eyes. Jerome Washington was sweating profusely, his hands gripping the edge of the head table, as if trying to anchor himself to a reality that no longer existed. To fund this wedding, Pastor Jerome did not just quietly mortgage our family home, I declared, my voice echoing with righteous, unyielding clarity. He stole $300,000 from the Urban Community Outreach Fund. He embezzled the very tithes you all sacrificed to give. Chaos erupted. It was not a murmur this time. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated outrage. Dozens of church members, deacons, and wealthy donors leaped to their feet. Head Deacon Marcus, sitting in the front row, aggressively ripped open the thick manila folder I had handed him earlier. He pulled out the high-resolution copies of the bank transfers. His eyes frantically darted between the projected screens and the papers in his hands. "This is a lie," my father bellowed, finally finding his voice. He stood up his chair, tipping backward and crashing to the floor. "This is a demonic attack on my ministry. She has fabricated these documents." "Look at the signature authorizations, Jerome Head," Deacon Marcus shouted back, his voice shaking with absolute fury. Marcus held the papers high in the air, turning to face the rest of the congregation seated in the ballroom. "These are the restricted outreach accounts. I am the secondary signatory on these funds. My signature has been entirely forged." He transferred $300,000 to an anonymous Delaware LLC. Marcus flipped to this next page in the folder, his face contorting with disgust. "And the LLC belongs to Julian Sterling." The undeniable confirmation from the head deacon shattered any remaining doubt. The elite country club ballroom devolved into a hostile interrogation room. Pastors began shouting at my father, demanding immediate answers. Wealthy socialites gasped, clutching their pearls as the sheer magnitude of the scandal washed over them. Jerome Washington, the untouchable spiritual leader of Atlanta's elite, had been caught red-handed, stealing from the poor to fund his daughter's extravagant vanity project. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, completely broken. I stood on the stage, watching the empire they had built on a foundation of lies burn to the ground. I felt no pity. I felt no hesitation. I was simply the match that ignited the gasoline they had poured themselves. But my mother was not going to surrender quietly. Vivian Washington had spent her entire adult life clawing her way to the absolute top of the social hierarchy. She refused to let her pristine reputation die without a violent, vicious fight. She stormed past the ruined head table, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. She ignored the shouting deacons and the humiliated country club members. She marched until she was standing right below the stage, glaring up at me with venomous, feral intensity. "You lying, psychotic wretch!" Vivian screamed, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of her usual refined elegance. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You fabricated this entire presentation because you are nothing but a jealous, miserable spinster. You cannot stand the fact that your sister is beautiful, successful, and deeply loved. You cannot stand that Chloe is getting the perfect fairy tale while you sit alone in a pathetic, empty apartment." The crowd quieted, slightly captivated by the horrific spectacle of a mother publicly destroying her own flesh and blood. Vivian mistook their silence for support and leaned into her cruelty, deploying the ultimate unforgivable weapon. "You are doing this because you are bitter!" Vivian yelled, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "You are bitter because you got into that accident, because you almost died in that hospital bed, and nobody cared. You realize that nobody came rushing to save you because you mean nothing to this family. You are completely irrelevant." The words struck the room like a physical shockwave. Even the most hardened, cynical socialites gasped at the sheer, undeniable malice of a mother telling her child that her near-death experience meant absolutely nothing. Aunt Gloria took a step forward, her fists clenched ready to drag Vivian out of the room by her designer hair. But I held up my hand, signaling Aunt Gloria to hold her position. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I went completely terrifyingly still. I stared down at the woman who gave birth to me, letting the absolute coldness in my eyes extinguish her feral rage. Vivian's screaming slowly died in her throat as she realized her cruel words had absolutely no effect on me. She had fired her best shot, and the armor I had built over the last several weeks was completely impenetrable. I leaned close to the microphone. The silence in the ballroom was so profound, I could hear the faint humming of the projector equipment. I looked from my mother to Julian Sterling, who was cowering near the exit doors. Speaking of almost dying, I tapped the spacebar one final time. The massive projector screens behind me flickered violently, wiping away the damning financial ledgers and replacing them with a stark, undeniable split image that stretched 10 feet high across the ballroom wall. On the left side of the screen was an official, highly detailed incident report from the Chicago Police Department. On the right side was a pristine, legally binding life insurance claim form from a premier national brokerage. The juxtaposition of the two documents was visually jarring, a horrific collision of violent crime and calculated corporate greed. I stepped back, allowing the sheer scale of the projected evidence to wash over the breathless crowd. I aimed my laser pointer at the left side of the screen, circling the heavily redacted text of the police report. This is the official accident report from the night my car was violently forced off an icy highway embankment. I announced, my voice echoing through the dead, silent room. For weeks, the authorities classified this as a tragic, unsolved hit and run. They found my vehicle crushed at the bottom of a ravine. They found me bleeding out, suffering from severe internal trauma, multiple broken ribs, and a severe concussion. But what they also found were trace amounts of matte black paint scraped aggressively across my rear bumper. I moved the laser pointer down the projected document, highlighting a specific bolded section of text that I had enlarged for maximum visibility. The police recently recovered security footage from a traffic camera 2 miles down the highway. I continued, making sure my enunciation was razor sharp. The footage captured a matte black custom Porsche speeding away from the scene with severe front-end damage. The camera also captured a partial license plate, a plate that perfectly matches a vehicle registered to a fraudulent Delaware LLC owned by Julian Sterling. A collective gasp ripped through the audience, heads whipped around, searching for the groom. Julian had backed himself against a decorative marble pillar near the main entrance, his face completely devoid of blood. He looked like a ghost, his hands trembling visibly as he clutched the lapels of his velvet jacket. The wealthy country club members, the pastors, the elite socialites, they all stared at him with unadulterated horror. The charming, sophisticated investment broker they had toasted just an hour ago was now exposed as a violent, cowardly criminal. But the story does not end there, I stated, drawing the attention of the room back to the stage. Because Julian did not just flee the scene of a near-fatal collision. Phone records pulled by the investigating detectives show that exactly 4 minutes after driving my car off that road, Julian made a frantic 40-minute phone call. And he did not call emergency services. He called Pastor Jerome Washington. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of shocked murmurs and outraged whispers. Church elders turned to glare at my father, who was still slumped in his chair at the head table, his face buried in his hands. He was a ruined man, his spiritual empire collapsing under the unbearable weight of his own monstrous hypocrisy. He knew, I declared, my voice rising over the growing commotion. My righteous, devoted father knew exactly who left his eldest daughter bleeding in the snow. He knew Julian was responsible, and instead of demanding justice, he orchestrated a cover-up to protect this wedding, to protect his precious social standing, and to protect his access to illicit funds. I turned my body, shifting the bright red dot of the laser pointer to the right side of the split screen. The life insurance claim form loomed over the room, the staggering financial figures and bold signatures impossible to ignore. Which brings us to the second document. I continued locking eyes with my mother. Vivian was still standing at the base of the stage, but the feral rage had completely drained from her features. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. The realization that her absolute destruction was imminent had finally shattered her delusions of grandeur. While I was lying comatose in the intensive care unit, breathing through a ventilator and fighting for my life, my loving parents were very busy. I projected, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of a physical blow. They did not come to the hospital. They did not sit by my bed or hold my hand. They did not pray for my recovery. Instead, they contacted their insurance broker. I moved the laser pointer to the bottom of the projected form, circling the two signatures scrawled in black ink. They initiated a claim on a comprehensive life insurance policy they had secretly taken out on me years ago. I explained, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. They attempted to convince the medical staff to declare me brain dead. They actively pushed to terminate my life support. And why would my loving, devoted parents want to pull the plug on their eldest daughter? I shifted the laser pointer up to the top right corner of the document, circling a massive, undeniable number printed in bold black ink. Because a massive payout was waiting, I stated, Julian Sterling ran me off the road. My parents knew. They let me rot in the ICU because a dead daughter was worth $1.5 million, but a living one was just an embarrassment. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum that swallowed all the air in the opulent ballroom. The sheer, unfathomable evil of the conspiracy had paralyzed the entire crowd. Pastors who had dedicated their lives to preaching forgiveness sat with their mouths hanging open, unable to process the demonic greed of their peers. Wealthy socialites stared at Vivian with pure, unfiltered disgust, viewing her not as a peer, but as a monster. My sister Chloe let out a sharp, hysterical sob. She collapsed into her chair at the head table, burying her face in her arms, her designer gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. Her fairy tale wedding had officially become the most spectacular, humiliating scandal in the history of Atlanta high society. Her reputation was permanently incinerated. Vivian Washington stared up at me, her eyes wide and completely hollow. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic justification, to spin another lie, but no words came out. The absolute truth had stripped away every layer of her performative country club armor. She was entirely exposed, a hollow, greedy shell of a human being, facing the absolute ruin of everything she valued. I looked past her, my eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the groom. Julian Sterling had reached his breaking point. The realization that his fraudulent empire was completely exposed, combined with the undeniable evidence of his violent crimes, shattered his remaining composure. He was staring at the police report on the massive screen, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He knew his high society life was over. He knew the federal authorities would be dismantling his shell companies by morning. He knew the violent underground syndicate would be hunting him for their missing $400,000. And he knew he was going to prison. He let out a primal, desperate yell. He turned away from the stage and bolted toward the main exit. A young cater waiter balancing a heavy silver tray of empty champagne flutes happened to be walking across the back of the ballroom. Julian did not even try to avoid him. He slammed his shoulder directly into the chest of the waiter. The young man cried out, stumbling backward. The silver tray went flying, raining shattered crystal glass, and spilled champagne across the polished marble floor. Julian did not look back. He scrambled over the broken glass, slipping slightly in his expensive leather loafers, his eyes fixed wildly on the heavy double doors leading to the lobby. He shoved an elderly church deacon out of the way, sending the man crashing into a decorative floral arrangement. Julian hit the brass push bar of the exit doors with both hands, throwing his entire body weight into his escape. He burst through the doors, sprinting into the grand foyer of the country club, desperate to reach the valet stand and flee into the night. He slammed into the heavy glass front doors of the club, pushing them open and stumbling out into the humid Atlanta air. He froze instantly. The grand portico of the country club was completely flooded with blinding light. The piercing rhythmic flash of brilliant red and blue emergency strobes bounced off the towering white columns and the polished hoods of the parked luxury vehicles. Half a dozen Atlanta Police Department cruisers were angled aggressively across the circular driveway, blocking any possible avenue of escape. A heavy tactical transport van was parked directly behind them, its side doors sliding open. I held up my phone. I didn't just bring documents, I brought warrants. The heavy glass doors of the country club swung violently inward. A dozen uniformed officers flooded the grand foyer, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor. Detectives in plain clothes led the charge, flashing badges that glinted under the crystal chandeliers. Julian did not even attempt to run. The sheer, overwhelming presence of law enforcement completely paralyzed him. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as a stern-faced officer forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed into the silent ballroom. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for felony, hit-and-run insurance fraud, and grand larceny," the lead detective announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Julian offered no resistance, his head hanging low as they hauled him to his feet and dragged him out into the flashing strobe lights. Inside the banquet hall, the remaining police officers marched purposefully down the center aisle, bypassing the terrified guests. They walked directly toward the ruined head table. My father, Pastor Jerome Washington, stood up slowly. The performative swagger he had carried for decades was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a defeated man. Jerome Washington, another detective, stated, stepping onto the elevated stage, "We are detaining you for questioning regarding the systematic embezzlement of community outreach funds and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Please come with us quietly." My father did not protest. He offered his wrists, allowing the officers to escort him away from the extravagant floral arrangements and the half-eaten plates of premium steak. The visual of the prominent megachurch pastor being marched out of a high society rehearsal dinner in handcuffs was a catastrophic blow. It was the absolute, undeniable end of his spiritual empire. The elite guests did not linger to offer their sympathies. The wealthy Jack and Jill members, the influential politicians, and the powerful pastors immediately began gathering their expensive coats and designer bags. They fled the room in absolute disgust, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Washington family scandal. The whispers of condemnation filled the air as they rushed past the catering kitchen, loudly denouncing the profound hypocrisy they had just witnessed. In less than 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely deserted. The lavish decorations, the untouched champagne, and the towering white orchids stood as a pathetic monument to my mother's destroyed social standing. Vivian sat alone at an empty table, staring blankly at the projected bank statements still blazing on the screens. Her reputation, her legacy, and her country club elitism had been instantly and permanently vaporized. The next morning, the harsh sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of my downtown Atlanta hotel suite. I sat by the window sipping black coffee, feeling a profound sense of peaceful clarity. The news had already broken across every local channel and social media platform. The headlines were ruthless, detailing the spectacular collapse of the Sterling and Washington families. My phone had been buzzing relentlessly with messages from former colleagues and shocked church members, but I ignored them all. I was simply waiting for the inevitable arrival. The sharp, frantic knocking at my hotel room door started precisely at 9 o'clock. I placed my coffee cup on the glass table, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored trousers, and walked slowly to the entryway. I opened the door to find Vivian and Chloe standing in the corridor. The transformation was staggering. Gone were the designer evening gowns, the flawless makeup, and the arrogant, untouchable postures. My mother looked disheveled, her face puffy and red from a night of uninterrupted crying. Chloe wore a simple gray sweatpants set, trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with desperate naked panic. They looked absolutely pathetic. Zendaya. Please, Vivian sobbed, pushing her way into the suite before I could invite her inside. Please, you have to help us. The police kept your father overnight. The church elders have already called an emergency board meeting to strip him of his pastoral duties. They froze all our bank accounts. We have absolutely nothing left. Chloe collapsed onto the plush sofa in the center of the room, burying her face in her hands. Julian is in jail, she wailed, her voice cracking with hysterical grief. His parents will not even answer my calls. The wedding is completely canceled. The vendors are demanding their final payments, and the country club is suing us for the damages to their property. I have no money, Zendaya. My entire life is ruined. I stood near the door, my arms crossed, maintaining a cold, unyielding silence. I watched the two women who had mocked my survival, who had actively conspired to terminate my life support for a cash payout, now begging for my mercy. The sheer audacity of their presence in my room was astonishing. Mom, you have to talk to the authorities, Chloe pleaded, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them Julian was not driving that car. You have that massive retention bonus from your accounting firm. You can hire the best lawyers to fix this. You can pay off the country club. You are family Zendaya. You have to save us. Vivian rushed forward, attempting to grab my hands, but I took a sharp step backward, refusing to let her touch me. We are going to lose the house, Zendaya. Vivian cried, her voice escalating into a frantic shriek. The bank sent a courier this morning. They are foreclosing on the ancestral estate. Your father leveraged the property to pay Julian's initial gambling debts, and now we are defaulting. We have nowhere to go. We will be out on the street. Please, I am begging you. I will do anything. Just pay off the bank. Save our home. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting smile. I simply stared at them, absorbing their desperate pleas with absolute clinical detachment. I walked over to my sleek black leather travel bag resting on the armchair. I unzipped the side compartment and pulled out a single crisp manila envelope. I turned back to face my mother and sister, my expression as hard and unforgiving as stone. I walked slowly across the room and dropped the envelope onto the glass coffee table right in front of Chloe. The bank is not foreclosing on you, Mom, I stated, my voice dropping to a dead icy calm. I am. Vivian blinked, the tears momentarily halting as confusion clouded her face. What are you talking about? I bought your debt, I explained, delivering the lethal blow with practiced precision. When I discovered that you and Dad were actively trying to pull my life support to cash in a fraudulent insurance policy, I realized I needed a failsafe. I used my retention bonus to legally purchase the promissory note on the Washington estate through a private holding company. You do not owe the bank anymore. You owe me. And you are severely in default. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as the horrific reality of the situation crashed over her. She stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Chloe leaned forward with shaking hands. She pulled the documents out of the envelope. It was not just the deed to our ancestral home. Attached to the front of the legal paperwork was a formal, notarized 30-day eviction notice. You cannot do this, Chloe screamed, throwing the papers onto the floor. You cannot kick us out of our own home. You are my sister. You are a monster. My life is completely ruined because of you. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no remorse. You ruined your own life, Chloe, I replied, my tone razor-sharp and unyielding. You ruined your own life for the sake of a fake Rolex and a country club membership. You ignored Julian's violent tendencies because you wanted the illusion of an elite marriage. And you, Mom, you sold your soul to maintain a fraudulent social standing. You chose greed over your own daughter's life. Vivian dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably onto the carpet. Zendaya, please, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. Where will we go? We have no money. We have no friends left. We will be homeless. That is the consequence of your actions, I stated, stepping away from them and moving toward the door. I opened it wide, gesturing for them to leave my suite. You spent my entire life calling me a failure. You shoved me into the darkest corners of your perfect events. You abandoned me in an intensive care unit. Now you get to experience what it actually feels like to have absolutely nothing. Pack up your bags. Failures do not belong in my properties. Get out now. 6 months passed since the night the Washington family empire shattered under the blinding weight of truth. The fallout was swift, violent, and utterly unforgiving. My father never returned to his beloved megachurch. Instead of delivering sermons to adoring crowds, Jerome spent his days sitting in a cold holding cell facing dozens of federal charges for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The same church elders who once bowed to his every command had eagerly handed over every financial ledger to the FBI to save themselves. The prosecution had an airtight case built entirely on the encrypted files I had compiled. He was looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. Vivian and Chloe were forced to vacate the ancestral estate exactly 30 days after our meeting in the hotel room. The transition from high society to absolute destitution completely broke them. With their assets frozen and their reputations incinerated, their elite network vanished instantly. The wealthy country club members who used to attend their lavish parties deleted their phone numbers and acted as if the Washington family had never existed. Today, Vivian works as a front desk receptionist at a dimly lit discount dental clinic in a dilapidated strip mall on the outskirts of Atlanta. She spends her shifts answering phones and filing paperwork for minimum wage, stripped of her designer gowns and forced to wear a cheap polyester uniform. She lives with Chloe in a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment that constantly smells of damp mildew and old cooking grease. Chloe had tried desperately to cling to her former status, reaching out to her bridesmaids for loans and places to crash. Every single one of them blocked her on social media. She now spends her days sitting on a stained secondhand sofa, endlessly scrolling through the luxurious lives of the women who abandoned her, mourning the fake Rolexes and VIP memberships that ultimately destroyed her. The vanity they worshipped had become their very undoing, consuming them, until absolutely nothing remained but bitter regret. Julian Sterling, the architect of his own demise, pleaded guilty to felony hit and run and multiple counts of corporate fraud. He surrendered to federal authorities to avoid being hunted down by the violent underground sports betting syndicate he had foolishly defrauded. He traded his custom velvet tuxedo and luxury sports cars for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a tiny concrete cell. Meanwhile, I returned to Chicago and reclaimed my life. The cold wind blowing off Lake Michigan felt like a baptism, washing away the lingering toxicity of my past. My physical recovery was a grueling journey, but I attacked my physical therapy with the same relentless determination I used to dismantle Julian Sterling. 6 months later, my ribs were entirely healed. The dark medical brace was gone, and I had full mobility in my right arm. The physical scars faded into faint silver lines, serving as quiet reminders of my survival rather than marks of victimhood. The emotional healing was even more profound. I no longer carried the suffocating burden of trying to earn the approval of people who were fundamentally incapable of love. I finally understood that family is not defined by shared DNA or ancestral legacy. Family is built on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and basic human decency. I had finally learned to respect myself, and that realization was the greatest inheritance I could ever receive. I channeled that newfound power directly into my career. I resigned from my corporate accounting firm and opened my own elite forensic accounting agency, specializing exclusively in catching high-level financial predators. My reputation preceded me. Wealthy clients, corporate boards, and even federal task forces hired my firm to track down hidden assets, expose embezzlement rings, and dismantle shell companies. I sat in my spacious corner office sipping hot black coffee, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. The morning sun reflected off the towering glass skyscrapers filling my office with brilliant golden light. I rested my fully healed arm on my pristine mahogany desk, reviewing a new case file involving a corrupt hedge fund manager. I smiled, feeling a deep, abiding sense of absolute peace. They had tried to bury me, but they failed to realize I was a seed. I had grown into something unbreakable, completely immune to their manipulation and greed. My apartment was no longer the silent, lonely space where I had wept over medical bills. It was a vibrant sanctuary filled with expensive art, lush green plants, and the quiet comfort of a life well lived. Aunt Gloria visited me often, bringing her boisterous laughter and unconditional love into my home. She was the only family member I maintained contact with, a fierce protector who had stood by my side when everyone else abandoned me. We spent our weekends exploring the city, trying new restaurants, and building a genuine connection that required absolutely no performance or pretense. She was my real family. As I closed the case file on my desk, my assistant knocked gently on the heavy glass door, bringing in a fresh stack of financial documents for my review. The work was endless, but it was incredibly fulfilling. I was no longer the invisible, discarded daughter hiding in the shadows of a grand ballroom. I was the architect of my own destiny, a successful businesswoman who bowed to nobody. I stood up, walking toward the massive window, watching the city move below me. I had finally survived the absolute worst, and I had completely won. Financial independence isn't just about paying bills, it is the ultimate armor against toxic people who try to assign you a price tag. Have you ever had to use your own success to shatter the illusions of a toxic family? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving, outsmarting, and reclaiming your power. Remember, never let anyone tell you your worth, especially when they are secretly bankrupt.